Hello and welcome to the Recovery Channel. I'm Dr. Richard Whitney. I'm Medical Director of Addiction Services at Shepherd Hill in Newark, Ohio. We're here to try to talk about an uncomfortable subject, about an epidemic in Ohio, and I'm sure the rest of the country is just as bad as Ohio is, and that is the epidemic of opiate addiction that is sweeping the country. Back many years ago when heroin was an issue, it was only an inner-city problem. But now we are talking about patients who are in the rural areas, suburban areas, teenagers, young adults that are being devastated by this addiction. And I want today to talk about opiates, about the disease of addiction, about what it encompasses and what we can do and what you can do to help people who are addicted to opiates. First of all, opiates are medications, opiates are drugs, opiates are pharmaceuticals. Opiates, more than anything else, are a combination of different molecules, primarily those of which that are grown in poppy plants like this. Most of these are exported from the #1 poppy producing country in the world, which is Afghanistan. You will see here, after there's a blade passed over the poppy, then we have an oozing of a material that is very high in opium. And this is what is actually collected by both pharmaceutical companies and by drug dealers to secure this complex chemical so it can be synthesized, distilled, and remade into a saleable product. And again, whether we're talking about morphine to save someone's life, or Percocet for a broken leg, or heroin to get someone high, they're all chemically related, but certainly have different products that will produce different effects. And in the people who are born with the disease of addiction and the brain and liver chemistry that will set them up for addiction, then it turns into be a horrible, terrible problem. Opiates have been in our civilization for thousands of years. There have been references to opiates back 4,000 years ago. Opium papaver somniferum. Somniferum implies it was first used for sleep as well as pain relief. In 1805, morphine was derived from opium, named after the god Morpheus, the Greek god Morpheus, god of sleep. In 1874, diacetyl morphine, or heroin, was synthesized. And this was initially, mistakenly of course, felt to be a non-addictive pain reliever. It was named heroin after the German word for heroic because it was felt to be such a breakthrough drug, but it certainly didn't work out that way. And in the 40s, opium was sent to the laboratory and tinkered with to make the variety of different opiates that we have in our society today. And then the brain chemical receptors were discovered in the 1970s. Here you can see different compounds that used to be perfectly legal. Here we have vapor oil treatment, which is 45% alcohol with 3 grams of opium in it. These were produced in legitimate places like Kalamazoo, Michigan. Vapor oil treatment number 6. Okay, and these contained alcohol, but most importantly opium, which was at that time sold for asthma and other spasmodic agents and conditions. These were back in the snake oil era. Again, we're talking about a legitimate company, the Bayer Company, the same company that markets aspirin, synthesized and sold heroin as a legitimate medical product because it was felt at that time to be a wonderful pain relieving agent without the possibility of addiction. And of course, we know that's wrong now. Here we have a variety of different opioid and opiate compounds, and we'll talk about the difference momentarily. We have drugs like Percocet, which is oxycodone. We have Vicodin, which is hydrocodone. We have Dilaudid, which is hydromorphone. We have OxyContin, and this is one of the main reasons that we're coming into heroin addiction now, is because OxyContin, which was a terribly addictive drug and responsible for many people becoming addicted to opiates, was reformulated. So instead of being able to be crushed and snorted or crushed and injected, these pills were reformulated so they turned into a goo which cannot be snorted or injected. And unfortunately, the drug dealers said, okay, we'll bring in some cheap heroin to replace it, and their profits went astronomical, and our incidence of addiction and diseases associated with addiction and opiate-related deaths went through the roof. We have brown powdered heroin, we have black tar heroin, One of the treatments we'll talk about is liquid methadone. Here we have morphine. We have dozens of different compounds, very similarly related chemically, but which produce some subtle different effects in the brain of human beings. The ritual of a heroin user, for those of you who've never seen this, and hopefully you've never seen it, such as a woman in Fort Myers that obtains the heroin compound, they put it in a spoon, which is then melted down into a liquid. It is drawn up into a syringe, and these syringes are very easy to obtain. Unfortunately, they're frequently shared amongst addicts, and diseases are passed from addict to addict. Tying off a vein and then injected into the vein, and the intense euphoric effect of the rush of heroin can be likened to an orgasm, followed by hours and hours of sleepy relaxation, pain relief, and no worry, man. Unfortunately, once this process started, people find it virtually impossible to stop without help. What happens is the brain has many receptors throughout this brain tissue that react to these chemicals, these opiates. They change the limbic system, which is the center of our emotions. They control automatic body functions such as pain and breathing. Unfortunately, suppress breathing, which can kill people. It also suppresses cough, which is why it's used in cough syrup. And most importantly, they're used for pain by blocking pain messages coming up from the body through the spinal cord into the brain. So we use it for pain relief in medicine, diarrhea, cough suppression, and so forth. People, unfortunately, have been getting hooked on prescription opiates ever since these were derived. There have been opium epidemics for hundreds and thousands of years, but now we have synthesized pure forms with high potency, and people who are destined for the disease of addiction by their genetics, once they get a legitimate prescription for Percocet, Vicodin, cough syrup containing hydrocodone or codeine, they get that euphoric effect. This is not because they're bad, dumb, stupid, weak-willed, or degenerate. It's because these opiates affect their brain differently than the majority of the population. 85% of people in our country can take opiates, take them and leave them, relieve pain, stop, throw away the rest of the prescription. People who are biologically predisposed to the disease of addiction react differently, over-enthusiastically, over-the-top, wonderful feelings of euphoria produced by the drugs, and then followed quickly by intense cravings to use more. In the brain, we have evolved over millennia, since we were simpler creatures, a reward pathway. This evolved into our brain when we couldn't think about going down to the 7-Eleven and picking up some bread and cheese. We had to go out and risk our very lives hunting wild game. So in order to say, okay, to survive, you've got to risk your life to find food when you're hungry, find water when you're thirsty, to secure a mate and have sex to pass your chromosomes to the next generation, and to seek comfort and protection with people that you like, i.e. your relatives, to protect you against a saber-toothed tiger. When we did these life-saving things, we were rewarded with a jolt of electricity in this part of the brain, which made us feel wonderful. Oh boy, when I eat, I feel good. When I drink water, I feel good. When I have sex, I feel good. So we survive and we pass our genes on to the next generation. This is called the reward pathway of the brain. More specifically, on a microscopic level, we have neurotransmitters that carry electrical signals from one brain cell to another across this gap called the synapse, and it hooks up with these dopamine receptors, which make us feel very good. And then when opiates are involved from specific opiate receptors, they trigger the release of dopamine, they trigger the release of synthetic opioids in our brain, and it produces an intense euphoric effect. And people can't help but want to get that effect again and again and again. The blue dots here are different parts of the brain that react to opiates. So opiate receptors are all through the brain. We don't just feel it in one little area. Very intensely, we feel it in the center of our brain, the most primitive part of our brain, the reptilian brain that evolved millions of years ago and is there to teach us just one thing, how to survive and pass our genes on. In this big part of the brain up here that just evolved relatively recently, just in the last few thousand years in human beings, we also have opiate receptors that cause us to do things and react in certain ways and relieve pain, and it works very well to do that. Unfortunately, this part of the brain, when it's triggered by opiates, can turn off the thinking brain, and we do all sorts of crazy things to get drugs that we know we normally would not do. Spend all of our rent money on on drugs and continue using drugs despite having to go to jail. This is why this intensely thinking part of the brain is overwhelmed, and why people say, why are you doing this? Don't you understand? The answer is yes, I understand, but I can't help myself. Again, the medical effects of opiates are primarily pain relief, drowsiness, relaxation, respiratory depression, which is an unwanted side effect, cough suppression. So we have opiate-containing cough syrup. It produces nausea and vomiting. It dilates blood vessels, reducing the blood pressure. So when people take opiates, their blood pressure can drop and they can fall over and get hurt. That sedation produced by opiates can cause physical injuries and death. When people go to IV drugs, they start sharing needles. It is not true that one's own needle, if it sits and dries out, that it can produce hepatitis. That is a false, mistaken belief. Hepatitis B and C is only obtained by dirty needles from somebody who has the disease, and it is transmitted by sharing a needle from person to person. Dirty needles and dirty skin not properly cleaned can also introduce bacteria into the heart called endocarditis. Terrible medical illnesses caused by intravenous drug addiction. Now again, briefly, what's the difference between an opiate and an opioid? Well, not much. Basically, an opiate comes from the poppy plant, and an opioid has to take that opium and cook it up in a chemistry set to make it into Percocet or Vicodin, or takes chemicals that have never seen the inside of a poppy plant and produces them like methadone simply in a laboratory. So an opiate comes from the poppy plant, an opioid comes from the factory. Essentially, they produce the same thing. The brain can't tell the difference. We have natural products, we have totally synthetic products, and we have products, again, that start with a natural opium from the poppy plant and are chemically changed so that they can be either put in pill form, absorbed under the tongue, or used by injection. There are different brain receptors that produce different responses in the brain. These are not that important other than the fact that some people say, oh my goodness, it makes me feel horrible. A lot of people say it makes me feel euphoric. This is not something we choose. This is something in our brain chemistry. Again, different kinds of opiates like morphine and codeine, which are natural, other drugs which are laboratory synthesized called meperidine. What we're going to talk about in the next section is how we start using these and how we progress to the next phase, which is abuse, and then to the disease of addiction.